Thank you, Brody. Good morning. Well, if this year has taught me anything, one of the major takeaways that I've had so far is to learn to be flexible. Things just have not gone according to plan for probably any of us this year. We have to learn to be flexible, and if you are like me, I've talked about it numerous times before. I'm the kind of person that likes to have a plan. I like to know what I can expect, and at least if I can know that things are going to deviate from the plan, I have expected deviations. Like I can anticipate what the alternatives will be, but years like this, circumstances that we have experienced have been teaching me to let go of that a little bit, to learn to expect the unexpected, as they say. This long series that we've been through in Acts, I think, has been appropriate for a time like that. Because we're seeing the story of God's movement that is unstoppable, and everything that happens, you might, if you were just on the ground looking at things from a worldly perspective, you would say this is stoppable, and it is going to be stopped, and things at every turn seem to go different than what a person might expect them to be, and God's movement is unstoppable in unexpected ways. Time and again, God's people are in what seem like impossible and overwhelming circumstances. But then God, as they say, shows up. Of course, he's been there all along, but we say God shows up and he achieves his purpose in ways that we and they maybe didn't see coming. During the last couple of months, we have been following in this part of Acts through Paul's journeys as he spreads the gospel, as God is working through this person, Paul, who is sort of one of the major heroes of the New Testament. He is perhaps the MVP, you might say, of the early church, and he is doing a lot, but he has been going through a very difficult time in his missions, right? Everywhere he turns, people are against him. Everywhere he goes to share good news, people try to get him killed. And he goes to the place where it all began in Jerusalem, and they try to kill him there. And then they arrest him, and they put him in sort of protective custody with Rome, and he is transferred over to Caesarea, and he spends a couple of years there held in Caesarea. How is he going to move forward? How is he going to do as he expects, as he's been told by God that he should get to Rome? How's he going to get there? Well, we saw last week that he takes an unusual course to get there. He says, in the midst of his trials, he says that he appeals to Caesar. And they say, well, you've appealed to Caesar, so to Caesar you must go. And even one of the officials makes the comment that this guy could have been freed. He could have been let go if he hadn't appealed to Caesar. But now he's going to be shipped off to present his case, to make his defense before the emperor of Rome, Nero himself. And he's going to get there not coming in triumph, as he would hope, or we might hope, but he's coming as a prisoner. So he is now setting sail to begin making his way to Rome. And I want to show you, this is probably similar to the type of ship that Paul was sailing on. This is a ship known as a Roman trireme. I knew it was something like that. It's a Roman trireme. This is actually a recreation that was built back in the 1980s that archaeologists were using to sort of study what things were like on these ships. But this was a very common vessel that was used, and so it was probably something very similar to this. And I would note that this is not a passenger ship. A passenger ship is a type of vessel that didn't really exist at this point in history. This was intended for shipping cargo around, and people could book passage on it sort of as an add-on. They could go on board, but you see all along the side of it there, you might be able to see there are oars sticking out. If you are on this ship, you are participating. You are part of the engine that drives this ship forward. And so this is Paul's trip to Rome. And they traveled along, leaving from Caesarea. They went around the edge of the Mediterranean Sea, making their way over here to the island of Crete. And you'll notice this doesn't just shoot out into the middle of the Mediterranean. It hugs where the land is, because that's the way these ships were designed to function. They weren't made to go out into the middle of open water. They relied on the breezes that came off of the land, and they were intended to stay close to the land. Paul, writing on this ship, this is something that is very familiar for him. He has spent a good deal of his life at this point on the sea. In fact, Luke tells us, just in Acts alone, at least about 12 times that Paul is sailing on a ship, and there may have been more than that. And it's estimated that he covered somewhere around 3,000 miles on the water in his mission work. He tells the Corinthians, when he writes to them, he tells them about his travels and all of the things that he's been through. And he mentions, prior to the story that we're going to look at today, he mentions that he's been shipwrecked 3 times and that he was adrift in the water for a night and a day. He has experienced not just sailing, he has experienced difficult times on the waters. And so you see, he is with this crew. He is a prisoner, but he is a Roman citizen, and he is unconvicted. He is not sentenced to death at this point. And so he has certain privileges on board. He's not just like shackled to the bottom of the boat or something. He has some privileges along the way. But he's sailing with them, and they stop here at the place called Fair Havens. When they get to Fair Havens, Paul has some advice based on his seasoned seafarer career. He has some advice for them, and he says this: "Since much time had passed, the voyage was now dangerous, because even the fast was already over." I'll pause there for a second. What Luke is talking about when he says the fast is already over, he's talking about the Jewish Day of Atonement, which places this about this time of year that we're experiencing right now, is about when this is taking place, probably in October-ish. And so this is a dangerous time of year for them to sail. This is when the waters are the most unpredictable. And in fact, from the middle of September to the middle of November is basically like very, very dangerous sailing in this region. And so Paul advises them, saying, "Sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of the cargo in the ship, but also of our lives." Paul says, we really shouldn't go out there. This is dangerous. We are going to lose the ship. We're going to lose the cargo, and we're probably all going to die if we go out and sail from here. But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. And because the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in, the majority decided to put out to sea from there on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete facing both southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. So it kind of makes sense if you're putting yourself in the place of the Roman centurion, the guy that's sort of in charge of this little endeavor. He is more apt to listen to the pilot of the ship and the owner of the ship than he is to some prisoner that's on board. Right? It makes sense that he would listen to them, but Paul is offering some pretty good advice. As I mentioned, this is a dangerous season for them to sail, but they're only trying to get around to kind of the other side of the island that they're already on. Like it's risky, but it seems like a calculated risk. The place that they're in isn't exactly the best place for them to hunker down for a while. They want to get to a better spot on the island, so they're just going to try to just make a quick little jaunt around to the other side. That's the plan. All of that kind of makes sense. What's really surprising, perhaps, is that Paul even said anything. I mean, does it surprise you at all that this prisoner aboard this ship of nearly 300 people speaks up to the centurion in charge and has some advice to give? Is that surprising to you? Well, on the surface, yes, but also no, if you know Paul very well. because we see him time and again making these bold kinds of decisions. This is the guy who, when an entire city in Ephesus was chanting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians," and whipped into a froth and probably would have destroyed him, he was wanting to go in there and preach. This is the guy who, when the crowds outside in Jerusalem were in a similar kind of situation, actually did go out and begin to share his story with them. He is bold in this way, and he is always seeking to share God's wisdom with the people that he's around. And so that's the first thing I want us to see this morning in this story, is that God's people bring God's wisdom into every situation. Not because they want to show off, right? But because they have love for the people that they're around who are in need of God's wisdom, right? This is the motivation of Paul, I believe. I think he looks around at these nearly 300 people that are on this ship, and he knows, he's experienced tough waters. He knows this is not looking good, and he wants to spare them. This, by the way, is a ship full of pagans and prisoners, criminals. Pagans, Roman pagans and criminals is on the ship that he is on, and he cares about saving them. He knows what he's talking about, as will be seen. He cares about the people on board, even if they don't care about him very much. You remember last week when we saw Paul sort of defending himself before Festus and before Agrippa. And Agrippa sort of laughed and said, you think you're going to convert me to become a Christian? And Paul says, well, I would love to convert not only just you, but all these other people that are around listening. I want them to be like me, except for these chains, he says. Paul was bold. He cared about the people that even were turned against him. He wrote in Ephesians famously, Ephesians chapter 4, verse 15, he says, speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in every way into him who is the head, into Christ. Speaking the truth in love. Those two have to go together, right? Speaking the truth without love, Paul will say you're a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal, right? Speaking the truth in love is bringing God's wisdom to people in a way that hopefully will change them for the better. So what wisdom has God taught you? What wisdom has God brought into your life through your experiences and as you followed him and the missteps perhaps that you've made? What wisdom has God taught you? And has he placed you somewhere? Has he placed you somewhere that you can speak the truth that God has revealed to you? A lot of times we talk ourselves out of that. A lot of times we think to ourselves, as Paul could have done in this situation, we think, they probably won't listen to me anyways, so I'll just keep my mouth shut. I'll stay out of it. This is none of my business, right? We talk ourselves out of it. But I would encourage you in situations you find yourself in every situation where God has revealed wisdom for you, prayerfully seek God's guidance. Prayerfully seek God's guidance. Care for the people around you and share God's wisdom with them. If we do that, then I think we're going the right way. So Paul shares wisdom with the crew of this ship. They don't listen. They take a calculated risk, and this is what happens. When the south wind blew gently, supposing they had obtained their purpose, they weighed anchor and sailed along Crete close to the shore. So it starts off good. It looks like they made a good decision. They rolled the dice and came out on top is the way it starts off. But soon, a tempestuous wind, that word in the original Greek is where we get the word typhoon, by the way. A tempestuous wind called the northeaster struck down from the land. And when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along. Now that may not sound as terrible as it really was. They're trying to come around this island and they need to turn north, but the wind will not let them. There's no way for the ship to go against the wind in this case, and it is a strong and powerful and unrelenting wind. The only thing that they can do is to go with the wind, allow the wind, instead of trying to tear the ship apart, allow the wind to carry them, hoping that it will die down, and they can regain control of the ship. And so they start off here in Fair Havens. There's a little island right here where they were probably hoping that would block the wind and they could regain control and come back around. And it didn't work, and so they're pushed out into sea. And remember, I told you, this vessel is not intended for the open water like this. It's intended to stay close to the shore. There was no way to fight it, no way to regain control. And as you see here, in the 2 weeks that followed this decision, they ended up 500 miles off course. But we'll get to that in a moment. This is what Paul had warned them about. He had tried to tell them this was a bad idea, but they would not listen. And so this is really kind of a side note to our main points here today. But I want to mention that when wisdom is rejected, storms are invited. When wisdom is rejected, storms are invited. What I'm not saying is that every storm that enters into our lives is because we didn't listen, right? Storms come for all kinds of reasons. Many of them are things that we get caught up in, not by any fault of our own, but being in the wrong place at the wrong time or whatever. There's devastation that happens beyond our choices. But when we reject the wisdom that God presents to us, we are inviting more storms. Inviting more storms on top of the ones that we just get caught up in. And there's plenty of things to get caught up in that we don't need to be inviting more storms. Am I right? We don't need that. And this storm that this ship finds itself in could have been avoided. Could have been avoided if they had listened to the wisdom from the man of God. But it rages on. They're doing their best as they go on, and as it pushes them out to sea where they're not really supposed to be on this journey. As it pushes them out there, they start using ropes to try to reinforce the ship and doing everything they can to try to keep things together. But the storm rages on, and they're trying to regain control. Read this and get a sense of their increasing desperation. Since we were violently storm-tossed, they began the next day to jettison the cargo. And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempests lay on us, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. Hope was abandoned. You see the progression of their desperation in the storm. They start throwing overboard the cargo, which was the whole purpose of sailing the ship in the first place. The prisoners were an add-on, as I said. This is a cargo ship. The only reason the owner of the ship was setting out to sea was to try to sell cargo to Rome to make money. Otherwise, there's no reason for him to be out there, and they start throwing it overboard. That's the desperation of the situation, and it gets even worse. When it says they threw the ship's tackle overboard, that can mean a few different things. It could be that they threw some of the sails off of the ship, even the main pole, the main support for the main sail. They may have thrown that overboard. Maybe it was beginning to break anyways. They were trying to lighten the ship however they could. It's not about getting cargo to Rome anymore. It's about staying alive. And we see now they have no stars, no sun, no guidance. What we're meant to understand there is that they are lost. They do not know where they are. So how can they even find their way to land? They don't know where they are, lost at sea. Have you ever felt desperation? The storm rages on. It rages stronger. It rages longer than you expected. and you're not sure what else to do, and you start jettisoning things, trying to do whatever you can to just survive this thing, and it just seems like maybe it's ultimately just more than you can handle. Have you ever been there? I know some of us have, and some of us will be. So what do we do in those times? Do we, like Luke describes the people on the ship, do we abandon hope? Just abandon hope. I guess this is it. I guess I just give up. Which reminds me of Job's wife. You remember the story of Job? Everything went wrong for him. And Job's wife said, just curse God and die. That was her advice. Just abandon hope. But I think this story is going to teach us, as we see what Paul does in this situation, I think we're going to see that desperation should not lead us to abandon hope, but to seek it where it can truly be found. Don't just give up, seek it where it can be found. We need hope. We need hope. Our spirits need hope like our bodies need oxygen. Like without it, we just suffocate inside. So do you know where to find it? Do you know where to turn when hope is in short supply? Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, he said, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. My yoke is easy, my burden is light." There's so much that can be said about that statement. But ultimately, what Jesus is saying, do you feel beaten down? Do you feel overloaded? Bring it to me. Bring it to me, and I will give you rest. It doesn't mean that the storm immediately comes to an end, but we can find peace even within the storm. Just like the other story of a boat in a storm on the water in the Sea of Galilee. The disciples were storm-tossed, and Jesus comes out walking on the water. Remember this story? Peter gets out of the boat and starts walking towards Jesus. And after Peter takes his eyes off the prize, so to speak, and begins to sink, and Jesus pulls him up, the storm is still going on. And they walk together back to the boat, and it's not until they get back inside the boat that Jesus calms the storm. But they go through the storm together. The storm doesn't stop, but they're able to make it through the storm by the power of Jesus, who walks above the chaos of the waters. So desperation shouldn't lead us to just abandon hope, but it should remind us to seek it. Not from places that we often turn to in this world, but to seek it where it can truly be found. And the best thing that we can do is to prepare ourselves before the storm comes. Be prepared before the storm comes. Surround yourself with people who will remind you when the storm comes. They will remind you of our hope in Jesus. Fill your heart with scriptures and songs that proclaim his goodness, that proclaim his presence with us, that proclaim his care. Fill your heart with those. Live lives of prayer that seek after God's presence in our lives, regardless of what's going on, so that we are equipped when the storm inevitably hits. And so Paul, in this story, as everyone around him is abandoning hope, perhaps even including Luke himself, because he speaks in first person there, Paul sees the hope that's fading, and he speaks up again with some more advice. Even though nobody listened to him the first time, he speaks up with some more advice, and he says this. Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and he said, "Men, you should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss." And Paul's not above a little "I told you so," I guess. "Yet now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar, and behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told." So what does Paul do? As he sees hope fade around him, Paul points to where hope is truly found. He tells them about the God that he worships, the God that he serves, that he belongs to, he says. And he tells them of what he has heard from that God. And we see how Jesus provides hope in this moment. We'll see it in two ways, I think. The first one is this: our faith sees beyond our struggles to God's purposes on the other side of the storm. Paul hears the message reminding him from Jesus that God has purpose for him beyond this temporary, difficult moment on the ship. That he is intended to stand before Caesar. That's new information, by the way. He's heard from God that he's going to get to Rome, but now more specifically, you will make it to Caesar. And so he takes from that, he understands that there is more to this story than the storm. That's a good reminder, I think, because sometimes as our storms rise up, as they intensify, sometimes it can seem like the storm is all there is. Like it's all we see. Certainly the people on that particular ship, when they looked out around them, that's all they saw. There was no land to see. There were no stars to see. There was only wind and waves and certain doom. That's a feeling of despair, but Paul reminds them that this is not the entire story. And he reminds you that what you are experiencing is not the entire story. There is more. Peter wrote to persecuted Christians. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 3. He said, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. According to his great mercy, he has caused us to be born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, to an inheritance that is imperishable, undefiled and unfading, kept in heaven for you, who by God's power are being guarded through faith for a salvation to be revealed in the last time." He tells people who are experiencing persecution about a living hope that they have. And he says in so many words, what you are experiencing is not the end of the story. There is more. There is an inheritance, and even if you face death, it's not the end. Even if these bodies that we have for the moment don't survive the storm that we face, there's still more to the story because death is not the end. There is an inheritance that is guarded and kept safe and nothing can take away. And so back on board the ship, tensions were high. As I mentioned, they were far off course. They were lost without the stars to guide them. They were battle-weary, facing the waves day after day. They were afraid for what was going to happen to them. They were pressed by the winds and the waves, and they were starting to suspect in the nighttime, in the blackness of night, land might be nearby, which sounds like a good thing, but if you can't see it, it's incredibly dangerous. They start to sense that the water is getting more and more shallow, and the text actually says that they dropped 4 anchors and prayed for daylight. They're terrified. The desperation even continues to increase, and Paul, even in this moment, speaks of hope again. He tries again to point them to the true hope that he knows, and he says this: as day was about to dawn, Paul urged them all to take some food, saying, "Today is the 14th day. It's been 2 weeks they've been battling this, that you have continued in suspense and without food, having taken nothing. Therefore I urge you to take some food. for it will give you strength, for not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you." And when he had said these things, he took bread, and giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. And then they all were encouraged and ate some food themselves. This is a really, really powerful moment, I think. It's a simple thing that Paul does. He recognizes that all the guys around him haven't eaten for 2 weeks. They've been too busy battling the waves, or maybe too anxious to eat, or maybe the food supply was running short because they had thrown so much overboard. But he encourages them to eat, and it's a simple thing. He wants them to gain some strength. But did you notice how Luke phrased it? Did you notice how Luke told the story of Paul sharing food with the people on board? Let me back up to the previous slide. He took bread, and giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. It sounds an awful lot like the way that Luke, same author, described in Luke chapter 22, verse 19, a meal that Jesus shared with his disciples. Jesus took bread. When he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them. He's using the same phrases. Now, I'm not saying that Paul was sharing communion with the people on board right here. That's not what's happening. He's giving them food that they need. But the way that Luke phrases it is intended to call this moment back to our minds, so that we see in the midst of this storm, this is my body. We see in the midst of this storm the presence of Jesus in the bread that is shared on board. We are reminded in this moment, why does Paul have hope? How can Paul be so hopeful and calm to share a meal in a moment like this? It's because Jesus is with him. And the presence of Jesus sustains us. And the encouragement we receive is contagious. Did you notice that Paul ate? And when others saw him do that, they were encouraged. And then they ate as well. It says they were encouraged. In your storm, Jesus is with you. He can lift your spirits, and it goes beyond you. Because as he lifts you up, as he is present with you in the storm, just like he walked with Peter through the storm, as he is with you, that encouragement can spread to the people around you. It is intended to do so. Paul wrote to the Corinthians, saying, 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 3, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in all of our afflictions, so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God." It's almost a tongue twister, right? And he's saying God provides this comfort to you because he wants to comfort you, but also so that you can share that comfort with others. God can encourage your neighbor by encouraging you. And you share that encouragement with your neighbor. Peter wrote also in 1 Peter 3:15 to always be prepared. Always be prepared to give an answer for the hope that you have, which suggests that our hope would stand out in the crowd, such that people would ask, "How can you be so hopeful in this affliction?" Peter says, be prepared to give them the answer. It's Jesus. So I'd encourage you to refocus on the presence of Jesus in the storms of life, whatever it rises up. And it can take many forms, and your storm may seem like no big deal to somebody else, but that doesn't mean it's not a storm that you face, right? Whatever it is that you face, refocus on the presence of Jesus. When things are falling apart, turn your eyes to the one in whom all things hold together. Sometimes when I am doing various things. Sometimes just when I'm studying in my office or working on sermons or things, there are times where I literally picture Jesus sitting on my couch. I would encourage you, use your mental imagery that God has given you to draw your mind into that space of focusing on his presence with you. A few years ago, I was having some dental work done, some surgery that was really uncomfortable. And while I was going through it, I kept picturing Jesus standing next to me, which sounds weird and maybe it's a trivial moment for that kind of thing, but it worked. I felt comforted by that, to know, to see, to imagine his presence with me, to bring a mental image to the truth that he sees us through, whatever it is that we face. So the presence of Jesus sustains us, and that encouragement that we receive is contagious. Paul shares that with the crew. Then the next morning, when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach. So again, they don't know where they are. They just notice there's some land. So let's see if we can get to it, right? On which they planned, if possible, to run the ship ashore. So they cast off the anchors, left them in the sea, and at the same time loosening the ropes that tied the rudders, and then hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. But striking a reef, they ran the vessel aground. The bow stuck and remained immovable, and the stern was being broken up by the surf. The soldiers' plan then was to kill the prisoners, lest any should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first, make for the land, and the rest on planks or on pieces of the ship. And so it was that all were brought safely to the land. I know we've read a lot of the story this morning, and I was trying to think, how can I cut this down? And I did a little bit, but there's so much good stuff here. This is really good storytelling for Luke. I'd encourage you to read it all through all at once. But this is where it all kind of comes to an end in this part. And we see these Roman soldiers with their prisoners getting ready to just execute them all. And you're like, really, you guys? Like, after all we've been through over the last couple of weeks? I mean, you saw the picture of that ship. 300 people, 276 actually, on that ship. There's no social distancing, right? There is no private space on that ship whatsoever. They have been in each other's faces. They've certainly shared some stories. They've had a bonding experience. They, in a weird kind of way, maybe some of them have become friends. And now, all of a sudden, they're like, line them up, let's kill them all. This is Roman soldiers being Roman soldiers. This is doing what they've been trained to do. This is the way the system worked. If they were to allow prisoners to escape, then they would be held accountable for that. We see that in some other stories in the New Testament. You remember the Philippian jailer who was ready to kill himself because he thought his prisoners escaped. And so we have this moment where death is looming. And if you sort of reimagine the whole story here, death has been looming throughout the whole thing. As if death is chasing these people, trying to get them, and at every turn they keep getting out of it because of the presence of Jesus with them. Somehow they made it. Somehow they survived. Somehow they were saved. Whether they swam or floated on planks from the ship, they found themselves with the beautiful beach of Malta under their feet. And just to wrap this all up, I just want to conclude with this point here. When we're in the hands of the author of life, death does not win. Death does not win. Death and the promoting of fear of death is the enemy's greatest weapon. But in Christ, that weapon is taken away. Our enemy is disarmed in that way because death cannot win in Christ. Death has been defeated in Christ. These bodies of ours will eventually fail, But death doesn't have the last say over our lives. We continue on in the hands of the author of life. Paul wrote 1 Corinthians 15, he quoted some prophecies where he said, death is swallowed up in victory. And he says, it's almost like taunting death. Oh, death, where is your sting? You can't get me. And so even though Satan brings out his strongest weapons against us, our hope, if it's placed in Christ, is unstoppable. It is unstoppable. And so I just want to wrap up this morning with the verses that we began with today. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 7 through 10. We have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. We are afflicted in every way, but we are not crushed. Perplexed, but not driven to despair. Persecuted, but not forsaken. Struck down, but not destroyed. Always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our bodies. So when times of distress come, as they surely will, we turn to the one who sustains us and has purpose and life for us beyond this storm.